The highest things in life are useless because they're done for their own sake. But I think we have so hyper-emphasized the useful that people are often lost. They don't know what to do with their useless time. And therefore, it's filled up with a lot of triviality.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the content director at Word on Fire. Joining me from the Santa Barbara studio is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, good to see you.
Hey, Brandon, always a joy to be on with you. How's little Gilbert doing?
He's good. He's walking around causing terror. He's taking swimming lessons now, which is, something that all families in Florida have to do when their kids are just a couple years old, and he's almost floating.
Is he like his namesake yet anyway?
He's
like
rotund,
Gilbert Keith Chesterton?
Yeah.
Is he rotund? Okay.
Hey, I've liked seeing a lot of the pictures and videos coming out of Santa Barbara as you guys try to figure out creative ways to still worship and share the sacraments and the liturgy with people. Of course, you did your daily online masses for a while, but in your local region of Santa Barbara, one cool thing you recently did was there was a whole drive-in service at a nearby parish where you offered benediction, sort of a liturgy of the word. Talk about that. How'd that come about and how'd it go?
Oh, it was marvelous. It was just, prior to getting the permission to bring people back to church, so we didn't have that yet, but the county said we could have an outdoor service if people stayed in their cars and didn't receive communion. So I said, yeah, let's do it. It's not perfect, it's not ideal, but it's something we can do. So I did it in two places, one up in Santa Maria, which is about an hour north of Santa Barbara, and then another one in Carpinteria, which is about 20 minutes south of me. And in each place we gathered, I don't know, maybe 200 cars, but each car I'd say had at least 2, 3, sometimes 4 people in them. So there were a lot of people there. And we got up on a little dais with the good sound system. And so we did basically the liturgy of the word for Pentecost. And then benediction. And it was very moving to me. We brought out the Blessed Sacrament and did the benediction. But just to have people there, they wanted to be in the presence of the Eucharistic Lord, And it was powerful for them. We had pictures of people weeping, They've been starving for the Eucharist. And it was almost like looking through the window of a bakery, I suppose, where you can't have the bread yet, but you're sensing it, So I was very moved by it. In both places, there was a marvelous turnout, a marvelous enthusiasm. One of my favorite moments happened in both places. At the end, the pastor got up and just said, it was wonderful to have everybody here, and we can't really see you. I wonder if you could somehow signal. So all these hands came out the window, but then people started to honk. And before you knew it, all the horns were honking. And it was like a little, like a little alleluia, a little liturgical expression. And the same thing happened in Carpinteria. At the end, as I was walking off, the horn started. Then everyone's horn was blowing, I don't know. I just loved it.
It's like the spirit groans in rumblings that even the heart can't understand.
Exactly, right.
Listen, today we're going to talk about the topic of distraction. Now, you and I have mentioned this on several episodes, especially the ones where we talk about social media and phones and their addictive qualities and all that kind of stuff. But I don't think it's any surprise to viewers of this episode, especially if you're watching it on your phone or on social media or whatever, that we're all hyper distracted. We feel pulled in a million directions. It's hard to focus on just one thing for an extended period of time. I think of Pascal's great quote that all of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. Do you think that quote is still true 400 years after he uttered it?
Oh, it's truer than it was when he uttered it. And what he meant, of course, was we distract ourselves so readily from the great questions that ought to preoccupy us. When you sit by yourself alone in a room, I know it's maybe an introvert's dream, but it means I got the time and the space to think about God, about the meaning of my life, about who I am, of what I'm doing. The trouble, Pascal said a long time ago, was divertissement in his French, diversions or distractions. And to be fair, he had a problem with this. He was somewhat addicted to gambling. And of course, Pascal is the famous wager of Pascal. Well, that's grounded in a way in his typical distraction of gambling. But he knew that he was frittering a lot of his life away. Now, here's Pascal, one of the great geniuses who accomplished more than almost anyone. But yet he himself thought, I frittered a lot of my life away with idle distractions. So he felt most of us most of the time. And I think, that's not a bad way to examine your conscience at the end of the day, is to go back and say, okay, how much of my day was spent in kind of trivial stuff, just distracting myself from the really essential matters?
Bishop, I think if anyone's self-reflecting honestly, they'll admit that they have way too many distractions in their lives, yet at the same time, we keep coming back to them. Why do we put up with all these distractions? Why do we keep going back to them?
Because we like them, because of Pascal's point, that we'd rather do that. It's hard to sit by yourself alone in a room. It's hard to wrestle with the really important questions. And so, of course, we prefer distractions. We prefer triviality. Now, look, I get it. You can't spend every moment of your life wrestling with the profoundest questions. I get it. Of course, we need, lighter, more trivial things. But do we spend most of our time doing that? One way to distinguish it, Brandon, is between leisure activity that's more contemplative in nature versus trivial or frivolous leisure activity. And that's an important distinction because you can be involved in leisure activity, let's say. You're not working, or maybe you're not wrestling with the most profound questions, but you're engaged in something contemplative, and that's all to the good. I think of, as a sports fan watching a baseball game, that's not really a divertissement in Pascal's sense, like an idle distraction. I think that's a form of contemplation. We can say more about that, but I'd make perhaps that distinction too. Lest you think everyone should become a monk and spend their entire life in a cell wrestling with the most difficult questions. I wouldn't want to go that far. But we've gone to the other extreme.
We're going to talk a little bit here in a moment about leisure. That's part of the reason why we titled this episode Distraction and Useless Things. Useless things being a good, not something we should avoid. We need things that we do for their own sake, not because they're useful for something else. But I want to, before we get there, spend a little time talking about this 2018 book. It's by Maggie Jackson, who has become sort of an expert in this realm of human distraction, and it's titled Distracted: Reclaiming Our Focus in a World of Lost Attention. She makes the point that a lot of the things that we get distracted by are good. They draw us towards some good end. However, these perceived goods actually drift us further from the ultimate goods. And she gives 3 examples. I want to spend a little time talking with you about each one of them. First of all, multitasking. She says the BlackBerry, at that time, now the iPhone, fulfills a longing in our American culture psyche that since work is perceived to be virtuous, the more we work, the more virtuous we are, then being able to multitask means we're more virtuous. We're always ready to take emails, always ready to answer a phone call, even if that means putting on hold what's in front of us. What's the danger of this multitasking dependency?
I think of it a lot. I travel a lot. I'm on airplanes. And, of course, you can't be on the iPhone when the plane's actually flying. But, when you're waiting in the waiting area and then you get on the plane, people are just, I remember so often thinking, can't that wait? I know you're dealing with some, businessman. That can't wait for a couple of hours. You have to do that right now. And so, it's introduced us to this sort of constant plugged in mentality. What's wrong with saying, no, part of the day I'm really unplugged from all that? Even though traveling is difficult in a lot of ways, there's something kind of nice. Like when I go traveling, I usually bring a book or like a more serious book. Because my move on a plane or a waiting area is to kind of cocoon. I kind of go in my own little space and I block out things and I'm really going to concentrate. Because in a way on the plane, you don't have a lot of distractions. You're sitting in your chair and you could turn on the movie or something if you want, but there you are. And you don't know the people on either side of you, so you don't have to talk to them really. And you can focus. That's a contemplative sort of move. But very often people do the other thing, as they say, no, I'll just keep working until the very last minute. Maybe unplug and contemplate rather than work.
It seems like the whole culture is fighting against this tendency to just focus, I'm thinking about airplanes and air travel specifically. I'm like you. I see airplanes as the best time to read.
Yeah.
It's my most contemplative time. I don't have obligations for kids or for work. I can just sit and
Yeah.
read. But even then, the little TV in front of you is like turning on automatically, even when I'm trying to turn it off, or there's announcements over the speakers. And when you get to the airport, a lot of restaurants and airports now set up iPads bolted to the table in front of you, not just to take your order, but to play games and stuff. And I'm like, I just want to focus on the person in front of me or the book that I'm holding. It feels like you're fighting a huge uphill battle.
Yeah, and all the time. And it's again that distinction between work and contemplation. Work is good. I mean, that's true in the biblical tradition. It's true in the great philosophical tradition. We all know that. Now, work I'm defining here as some practical activity that we do for the sake of some greater end. So you go to work in order that you might, get the money which you need to take care of your family. You go to work that you might have the money you need to pay for your apartment or whatever it is. Fine. But then what do you do when you do have that time? When you are actually with your family, they've been fed, you're now home in your apartment that you've paid for through your work. Now what do you do? And see, I find people often have a hard time answering that question. What do I do when the goal of my working has been achieved? See, the useful has done its thing, which is great. Now comes the beautiful time for the useless. And you mentioned that earlier. That's Aristotle's great intuition. The highest things in life are useless because they're done for their own sake. But I think we have so hyper-emphasized the useful that people are often lost. They don't know what to do with their useless time. And therefore, it's filled up with a lot of triviality. It's filled up with divertissement rather than with legitimate objects of contemplation, if I can put it that way. One of which might be, I love when parents do this. They'll talk about just looking at their kids can be a great source of joy, and I mean joy like with a capital J, like a deep sense of the meaningfulness of their life. That's a contemplative exercise. Playing with your kids is a contemplative exercise, right? Because it's useless, but you're spending time in this joyful activity with your kids. Reading a book or watching a film or going to a baseball game, those two are contemplative activities. I think in our culture, we grossly underplay all of that. We don't train people how to do it. We train them in the work mode, the useful mode. But the useless side of life, we don't. And therefore, it does get filled up with divertissement, and that causes spiritual trouble.
In her book, Distracted, Maggie Johnson mentions a second culprit behind this distraction culture. The first is sort of multitasking and this emphasis on work. The second, though, is speed and efficiency. So we're always trying to find the quickest, easiest, most efficient way to get something done and to maximize our output. I've noticed, though, especially among millennials and Gen Zers, there's sort of a return to the slow, the non-digital ways of doing things that are less efficient, that take longer, but they're doing them on purpose because there's a value in not just trying to maximize your potential. But I found if that's your goal, if you're just trying to complete as many projects as possible, people become, in her words, administrative appendages. They're just sort of cogs in the machine of your efficient life. Then distraction is the inevitable outcome because there's just so much going on.
Yeah. Years ago, I used to give a mission, a parish mission, and it was called Food for the Soul. What is the soul like? And one of my themes there was, the soul likes to go slow. So we are addicted to speed, that's true. We like speed in everything. Fast connection. This is a faster program, that gets me. All right, but then when you've quickly gotten all these tasks done, you've quickly gotten where you want to go, now what do you do? See, because now the soul kicks in. The soul likes useless things, and useless things should be done slowly because you're meant to savor them, not race your way through them, right? Think of people, and it's largely lost art in America, but when I was in Europe studying, you'd see this. You see it still now in Rome when you go there. People that know how to savor a meal. You know the way Europeans eat. You get to a restaurant and you're just there. You're just, long as they gave you a table, order your food. The food comes slowly, a bit at a time. You savor it, you linger over it, you spend many hours in conversation. It's not at all unusual in Europe. Start eating at, you get there at 7:30, dinner comes maybe 8-ish or so. It's now 10:30. You're having your after dinner drink or something, you're still talking. That's not indulgence, or that's not something decadent. There's something beautiful about that. It's someone who knows how to go slow through this great event of eating and socializing and spending time with, What do we do now? I'm guilty of this too. Get to the restaurant, where's that waiter? Where's the waiter? Come on, let's order. The food comes, and then how often, look around a restaurant in America, what you'll see is people now, they're all together at the table, but they're all like this, right? They're all looking at their phones. No, this is the time for you to talk to each other, look at each other, listen to each other. I'm a baseball fan. A classic critique of baseball, and there's something to it because the game has gotten too long. I agree with that. But a classic critique is, baseball, come on, it's so slow. I mean, come to hours and hours. No, but you're meant to savor a baseball game. You're meant to spend a lot of time with it, looking and listening and watching what's going on. That's a lost art.
Well, Maggie Jackson has a bunch more analysis of how we became such a distracted culture. So I encourage people to check out her book. Again, it's titled Distracted 2018. But I want to spend the rest of this episode on practices we can adopt to alleviate our hyper-distracted lifestyles. The first one, and I think we've hinted at it a few times already, is to favor leisure and useless things. And I think here, not just of the ancient Greek philosophers, but more contemporary people like Romano Guardini, Joseph Pieper, his writings on leisure, and the late Roger Scruton, who wrote a lot on quote-unquote useless things and their value. How do we find things, Bishop, that are properly leisure and useless things, and how do we stick with them instead of getting distracted by other things?
Don't you love people? I think of William F. Buckley. I'm dating myself here a bit, but prominent figure some years ago. But Buckley was a great social commentator, political commentator. But he was a man of great passions, and one of them was sailing. And he was a sailboat, these large ocean-crossing vessels. And Buckley has these wonderful books about when he crossed the Atlantic Ocean with friends, crossed the Pacific Ocean with friends, and the great adventure of that, and loading the food and the wine onto the ship for their leisurely, elegant meals and so on. But also talking about navigation, talking about the weather, talking about just spending time on the deck, looking at the stars and so on. I love that as someone who was so clued into this useless thing, because heck, you could take a plane across the ocean much more efficiently, but they chose this older form of transportation that involved these sort of contemplative disciplines of studying and looking and waiting and so on. Develop a passion for useless things like that. As I mentioned, baseball. Sports is by its nature contemplative. That's what the Greeks understood. And we might see it more superficially, but they didn't see it superficially at all. It was a type of contemplation of the beautiful, Books, obviously, you and I are great bibliophiles. Read a good, deep, profound book that takes a long time to get through and to understand. You can't do that superficially.
Let's talk about another practice to adopt, and that is to turn our noisy devices, like our iPhones, into more single function or limited type devices. There's been a trend among all electronic devices to have more functions and be able to do more at one time. I'm thinking specifically of the Kindle devices. Originally a Kindle was just a device to read books. You could download books, you read a book. Now even Kindles have added apps and music and the internet browser and all this other stuff. So they're inviting you to go from your book to some other activity, making it harder to read. We talked, several months back about Digital Minimalism. It's a book by Cal Newport, and he posed the question, ask what tasks that you need your iPhone for example, and then ask yourself, are there simpler ways to accomplish this goal, either on my phone or through another device, that remove these distractions? So I don't know if it's like reading latest articles on the website that you keep checking multiple times every day. Can you instead set aside an hour once a week and then just catch up on that day? Is it really necessary to check it 10, 15 times a day? But I think a lot of people struggle with this, Bishop, with iPhones. It feels like there's a never-ending invitation to click this, try this, open this app, go to this website. You experience that. I know you do, don't you?
Sure. And the makers of all these things know just what they're doing. They know it's not that hard to get someone addicted to something. We're animals attuned to addiction, it seems to me. And they know how to do it. And you're right. You start looking at the iPhone, and before you know it, you're drawn into something like, why am I looking at this? Why am I spending time? My favorite example is just the Facebook feed. There's things coming up on Facebook, but you find yourself kind of scrolling through it.
And it's endless. It never comes to an end. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, it's an endless feed.
Yes, and then you say, but wait a minute, why am I doing this? There's something too about screens. I don't know if it's the bright light, it's the colors. There's something about screens that draw us or addictive. We're like looking at the printed page of a book. That can be like, oh, it's kind of drab. Give me some pictures and some color. Now again, I love pictures and color. But there's a danger, because if you're distracted away from things like books that require a lot more attention, whole worlds remain opaque to you. I found this, Brandon, in my years of teaching. So I taught at Mundelein from 92. I became rector in 2012. So on and off for about 20 years. I noticed it for sure in those 20 years, a certain decline in people's capacity to read a lengthy and complicated text. So when I first started teaching, you'd assign, I want you guys to read, these 75 pages of the Confessions for next time. I want you to read, this whole section of Plato's Republic. And then as the years went by, people would say, Father, I can't possibly read all that. I'm not going to spend all that much time.
Read these 2 paragraphs by next class, and then you'll be good.
Yeah. Oh, wait a minute, it's too much. So I know that's the danger, and it's a discipline. And you've got to give it time, and you've got to talk to people who know how to read books. Like something I use all the time is a pen. So if I'm reading a book seriously, not something before I go to bed. I'll read like a novel or some history before I go to bed. But if I'm reading seriously, I always have a pen in my hand because it keeps me in the game. It's like keeping score at a baseball game. If you're keeping score, your mind's really in the game. So with the pen, I'm checking, questioning, what? I'm commenting on the book, or like, yeah, good. Or then an arrow, oh, that sounds like something else I just read. So that keeps me in the game. So there's disciplines you can use. But we've got to get better at that, I think.
When I came into the Catholic Church, one of the new practices for me was Eucharistic adoration. Never heard of it before, never practiced it before. But I know a lot of people in my generation, raised around noisy screens and notifications and news feeds and all that stuff, find Eucharistic adoration to be such a relief, because you walk into this room, no sound, no conversations, no quiet. There's a locus of attention. Everything's directed toward one thing, adoring the Lord in the Blessed Sacrament. And especially if you commit to like an hour of adoration, you tell yourself, I'm locked in here. There's nothing else that's going to pull me away. I'm committed to this. That sort of like rewires and retrains your mind and makes it easy to contemplate elsewhere. What else does the Catholic spiritual tradition offer as an antidote to our distracted culture?
Oh, so much. Think of Lectio Divina, which is that very slow, prayerful way to read the Gospels or read any part of the Bible. Contemplative prayer. So Eucharistic adoration, I think, participates in that category of contemplative prayer. Think of meditation, an Ignatian-type meditation, where you spend the time to enter into the scene of a gospel story, and you look and you smell and you hear what it's like, and so on. All of those are contemplative practices. Or even something like, you go to the great medieval cathedrals and you find those labyrinths. And I've always loved that, because the labyrinth, let's say it's Chartres, the most famous one, you enter, and I've walked it a couple times, and it takes you a long time. It's a big thing, and it's a winding path, kind of intestine-like. It winds back on itself, and and goes here, and you start here and you end up like there. You could walk there in like 10 or 5 steps, but you've just taken 25 minutes to get there in this sort of meandering way. Well, remember, the soul likes to go slow. It doesn't, boom, like to get there. It likes to go slow. So, I mean, all those are practices designed to overcome this sort of trivialization or divertissement approach and learn to look. You know, so much of prayer, even go beyond the Christian tradition here, go into the Eastern, like Buddhist traditions, is just to be awake to something, really awake to it. Here's a flower. Here's a river going by. To really see it. Do I see it? Watch it. Contemplate it over a long period of time. Those are all kind of soul calming moves.
If we could offer maybe one final recommendation at the risk of sounding a little self-referential, but the last episode we talked a lot about the Word on Fire Bible, and I think that text itself can be a major antidote to distraction because it pulls you in through the art and through the scriptural text. It's something you can sit with for a long while and meditate on and reflect on. So maybe if you want to start reading deeper books and longer reading sessions, maybe try it with the Word on Fire Bible, because in some ways it's made for that kind of deep contemplative reading.
That was behind that Bible in many ways, was this whole idea of how to draw someone into the Bible, especially distracted contemporary people. Here's a Bible with some little tiny footnotes at the bottom. That's probably not going to do it. But something that does grab their attention through the visual, but also lures them into a contemplative stance. That's very much behind what we were doing there.
Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. You can send in questions to the show by visiting askbishopbarron.com. You can record your question on any device. Today we have one coming from Gabriel in Massachusetts. He's asking about how to prove that there's a transcendent realm. Here's the way he puts it.
Hello, my name is Gabriel from Natick, Massachusetts. My question is a prerequisite to the question of God. How can we prove there is this other dimension, something we don't inhibit, and that we can't measure and scientifically or mathematically prove? Thank you.
Yeah, good. I mean, in many ways, that's the question of basic apologetics. But I'm going to take a clue from the question itself. Think about mathematics for a second. Mathematics. Plato understood this. It's still true. When you move into a properly mathematical realm, you're not looking at 7 items in front of you. You're contemplating the number 7. You're not looking at a triangularly shaped figure in front of you. You're thinking now about a triangle or about a circle. Not a circular shape that you can see like that camera lens, but circularity, a circle in the geometrical sense. You have stepped out of the sensible world because points and circles and lines and triangles in the abstract sense are not visual items. They are pure abstractions. They are, if you want, invisible realities. Now, press it a little further. You mentioned both math and science. All of science rests upon objective intelligibility, right? There has to be some kind of formal structure to reality, or the sciences cannot get off the ground. Therefore, something like ordered harmonies necessarily structure a scientific approach to life. Press it further, especially contemporary science. Read Einstein and the quantum theorists and all those people. It is inextricably tied to mathematics. You can't do high science, especially today, without desperately abstract mathematics. Therefore, science, we say, that most orders me to the sensible world. Well, yes, in a way, but you can't analyze the sensible world scientifically without mathematics. Mathematics is in itself invisible. It's a non-sensible reality. I think of my nephew, who's at MIT and doing all this high science, and he's going to be, building and designing robotics and all this business. Terrific. It's about the sensible world, but he cannot begin to do that work without being very comfortable in the invisible world. That's why mathematics actually is one of those doors that opens to what I would call, and I think you're hinting at it, a transcendent world. See, I'm just a bitter opponent of this reductive materialism and scientism, which is compromising the souls of people today. And I just want them to say, even as they hold up science, which they should, I hold it up too. We love science. We love science. But to say science is to say math. To say math is to say the invisible. And so don't play this game of, oh, these poor old religious people with their crazy, wacky ideas about a higher world. If you're doing science, you are in the higher world that I'm talking about. You've at least walked through into the vestibule of the world that I'm talking about. So I would turn that on its head, that objection. It's precisely math and science that orders you to a transcendent world. Okay, end of rant on that subject.
Well, as we work to get Bishop Barron's blood pressure back down to normal levels, I wanted to mention one final time to pick up your copy of the Word on Fire Bible. We talked about it during the whole episode last week. It just came out last week on June 15th. But you can find it at wordonfire.org/Bible. We have 3 beautiful versions, a paperback version, a hardcover version, and then the leather version. If you have young sons or daughters or college students or just people in your life that haven't read the Bible, aren't familiar with the Bible, don't like religion, this is the book you can pass them to lure them back in, to become re-enchanted with the religious world of the Bible. So check it out at wordonfire.org/Bible. Well, thanks again for listening.
The technical and traditional word for it is calumny, which is to say, the mean-spirited and unjust accusation of another person. Precisely because it's a violation of both charity and justice, calumny is properly categorized as a mortal sin. You know, years ago when I first started posting articles and videos on the internet, I frequently engaged the so-called new atheists. Predictably, they weren't overjoyed at my contributions, and they often commented pretty bitterly on my sites. Sometimes atheist influencers would direct their followers to fill the com boxes of my videos with disparaging and ad hominem remarks. Well, after dealing in more recent years with some acerbic Catholics in these same forums, I can honestly say I prefer the atheists. Now, I must admit that the vitriol, negativity, personal attacks, and outright calumny that come regularly from self-professed Catholics is just dismaying and disedifying in the extreme. The most recent example is the reaction to an article that I wrote last week regarding the right relationship between clergy and laity in their shared engagement of the culture. Relying on the Vatican II document Lumen Gentium, which I extensively cited, I calmly made my argument. I attacked no one. I indulged in no character assassination. I never made an ad hominem remark. I simply laid out the clear teaching of an ecumenical council and tried to apply it to our present situation. Now, was my article susceptible to criticism? Of course. As Cardinal George used to say, in the spirit of St. Thomas Aquinas, no matter what you argue, there's always a sed contra, right? But on the contrary. He meant that even the most finely articulated demonstration has left something important unsaid, or some angle unexplored, or some nuance undeveloped. And so are people justified in bringing up objections and counter-arguments? Naturally. But in the wake of my article, I must say, armies of commenters, encouraged by certain internet provocateurs, inundated Twitter and all of my social media sites with wave upon wave of the most hateful, vituperative, venomous words that you could imagine. I was called spineless, gutless, cowardly, and that's just to mention the most benign and unobscene remarks. For 4 days, I had to assign 3 of my co-workers at Word on Fire full-time, simply to remove the most poisonous comments, time that they could have spent on much more fruitful evangelical efforts. Now, I realize it's much easier to engage in this sort of mean-spirited mob action than it used to be. Years ago, if you were angry about an article that you read and you really wanted to let the author have it, you would have been obliged to write a letter, find an envelope and a stamp, send your diatribe to the editor of the paper or journal, and then you would have been at the mercy of that editor, who most likely would have thrown your cruel and poorly argued letter away. Now, all you got to do is type your words into a computer, and they appear in a matter of seconds, unedited, for all the world to see. And furthermore, you can do this more or less anonymously. Hence the prevalence and virulence of Twitter mobs. But may I, as a spiritual father, issue a kind of pastoral cry of the heart to my fellow Catholics who practice this sort of thing. Cut it out. The kind of attack that I endured last week, and many other people endure these, and they remain sadly rampant on social media, it is just a moral outrage. The technical and traditional word for it is calumny, which is to say, the mean-spirited and unjust accusation of another person. Precisely because it's a violation of both charity and justice, calumny is properly categorized as a mortal sin. Could I pose the question to the army of Catholics who posted outrageous comments on my social media sites? Though I know you want to appear tough-minded in front of your colleagues, can you honestly say, when you reread your remarks, that you're proud of them? Honestly. Now look, I've been at this social media game for a long time. I'm well acquainted with Harry Truman's famous comment, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. I get it. When you make an argument in the public space, you got to expect opposition. But once again, everybody, there's a sharp distinction between legitimate argument and calumny. A real argument involving the marshaling of evidence, the citation of authorities, the fair and careful reporting of one's opponent's position, etc., is morally praiseworthy. For real argument fosters both truth and love. It seeks to shed light on what is really the case, truth, and to invite others to see more clearly. It's a type of love. Calumny, on the other hand, is indifferent to truth and is inimical to love. And if I may be permitted a final observation, I can't imagine a more effective evangelical countersign to the wider world than the kind of mob action that I witnessed last week. Can you imagine a non-Catholic, a non-Christian, a religious seeker, a non-believer coming onto one of my social media sites out of genuine curiosity and seeing how Catholics were responding to a bishop who had made an argument? Who could possibly forgive them for thinking, I don't want any part of that group? You know, as Tertullian reminded us long ago, what first attracted many pagans to Christianity was the obvious love that Christians showed to one another. What effect do you think Catholic Twitter mobs are having? So look, everybody, I understand people are passionate, especially about religious matters. But when it comes to this commentary, we always must keep truth and love in the forefront. Catholics on social media, you need to pick up your game. Thanks so much for watching. I'm standing in the Annapolis National Cemetery. It's a military cemetery. It's about a stone's throw from the Naval Academy, where I spoke last night. And some people wonder whenever a minister of the gospel, a priest, a bishop speaks at a military academy to military people, is there a contradiction between the commitment to be a soldier and the gospel? And of course, I see where the tension comes from. The Sermon on the Mount, the love of enemies is central. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who maltreat you. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn and give them the other. Resist not evil, Jesus says. So there is, of course, coming up out of the Sermon on the Mount, a great tradition of nonviolence within Christianity. In point of fact, in the early centuries, a lot of Christians felt, no, they couldn't serve in the armed forces. They had to walk the peaceful way of Jesus. Well, I've spoken many times before about the extraordinary power of the path of nonviolence. And when you see it practiced by someone like Martin Luther King, who knew those texts very well, it can be, in certain circumstances, a very effective way, lovingly to engage the wickedness of another. I've compared it sometimes to Aikido, the martial art where you use the momentum of your opponent against him. So I believe very much in the power of nonviolence, both as a witness, but also as an effective tool in opposing violence. But let me add this now. When you get to the 4th century and a figure like St. Augustine of Hippo, the Christian church is realizing that, granted all of that and not gainsaying any of it, we live in such a finite, conflictual world, sinful world, a fallen world, that sometimes the only way to oppose great wickedness is to use violence or use force. Now, begin not at the grand national level, but at the very personal level to see the point. You're the father of a family. Someone has invaded your home. They're threatening your wife and children. Well, what do? You're unlikely to stage a nonviolent social protest. At that point, you're going to use force to defend the lives of the innocent. So extrapolate from that. That's what Augustine does. Extrapolate from that experience now to the national level. If a nation is being aggressed in such a way that innocent life is being threatened, sometimes in this fallen, finite, conflictual, sinful world, you have to use requisite force to protect the innocent. And it's from that instinct that the so-called just war theory emerges. Augustine being one of the great exponents of it, St. Thomas Aquinas adding to it, and then throughout the Catholic tradition, people have added nuance to it. And I want to make the point that the just war theory, far from a warmongering exercise, far from, justifying all war, is in fact setting very severe limits to war. You might say always haunting the just war theory is Jesus' great call to the love of enemies and so on. So what are some of these criteria that the Catholic tradition has invoked to justify war in certain circumstances? Well, here's the first one. A just war must be declared by a competent authority. That's to say, some government agency or individual who speaks for the totality of the people. So a just war is not one that's prompted by some particular group or some family working out a problem. It's declared by some agency that speaks for the whole people. Here's a second criterion. There must be a just cause. Now, in recent years, the church has really restricted this. The only finally just cause is when innocent life is being aggressively threatened. So when a country is being attacked or invaded, it may, as it were, put its arms up in self-defense. So there must be a competent authority declaring the war, a just cause. A third consideration, there's got to be a proportion between the goal to be attained and the terrible destructiveness of the war. And so if you're convinced that, no, that the price is just too high here, yes, we're trying to defend the innocent, but in the process we're going to cause far much more mayhem, well then we're not dealing with a just war. A couple other criteria that I think are interesting. One is the reasonable hope of success. So entering into a just war, you have to have some sense that, yes, we're likely to be successful in this enterprise. If it's a hopeless undertaking, well then it's not really a justified war. A final criterion is what we call the right intention of the belligerents or of the warriors. So even if the war is justified, but you're going into it with the wrong attitude, you're fighting for another reason. I just don't like those, Germans or Japanese or Russians. Well, that's not a legitimate ground. Now, here's the thing. For the war to be justified, all of these criteria have to obtain simultaneously. All of them have to be the case. Now, I hope you can see from that far from, encouraging war, these are setting very strict limits on war. Moreover, what I've just described are called the jus ad bellum requirements. That means justice on the way to war. So what would justify going to war? There are two more criteria called the jus in bello criteria. That means what's justified in the actual fighting of the war. And here we have two very interesting ones, namely proportionality. So again, there's some proportion between the goal to be obtained and the destructiveness of the means being used. And the second criterion is discrimination, that we can discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. So there's not a wanton destruction of the lives of innocents, because that would defeat the whole purpose. I'm trying to protect the lives of the innocent. So, for example, let's say, and I think most would agree with this, that World War II met the criteria for the jus ad bellum. That we'd say, yeah, World War II was a justified war. Nevertheless, when it comes to the actual fighting World War II, there are certain elements I think now we'd have to say were not justified. Think of those terrible fire bombings of Dresden and Frankfurt and Tokyo, not to mention the atomic bombs, which in my judgment and that of I think most others, would violate both proportionality and discrimination. Again, we're setting severe limits to war, always keeping in mind the great command to love. Now, keep that in mind. To love means to will the good of the other. What's the motivating justification for war? It's the protection of the innocent. That's an act of love. See, don't set love and warfare necessarily as opposed to each other. To love is to will the good of the other. The father defending his family is loving his family, right? And so soldiers defending their country in a just war are engaging in an act of love. Now, as you see behind me, the graves of all these soldiers, can we, with great admiration, remark the virtue in these people? And I'd say, yeah. Think of the great cardinal virtues, justice being one of them. Yeah, people that went to war convinced that they were fighting in a just war, trying to set something right. They were following the virtue of justice. Think of the virtue of prudence. That's kind of canny moral know-how. Sure, they exhibited that. The virtue of temperance. That means the self-control required in order to get the job done morally. I think of the kids I met yesterday at the Naval Academy going through all their different forms of training, and they're being, compelled to discipline their own passions and desires, to discipline their own bodies. Well, that's a virtue of temperance required for the achievement of justice. And then, of course, probably most obviously, courage, the great virtue. It's hard to imagine any sailor or soldier not exhibiting courage. So we think of the paradigmatic soldier fighting in a just war, someone who exhibits these great virtues and someone whom we admire and who is finally ordered to and by love. And that's why even as we honor the great tradition of nonviolence, as we should, we can also honor those who are willing to fight in a just war. Let me make just one more observation. My mentor, Cardinal George, said this years ago, and it's always stayed in my mind. Like me, Cardinal George admired people like Dorothy Day, who was a pacifist. Think of Stanley Hauerwas, a theologian I admire very much, who's a strict pacifist. Cardinal George said, I'm glad there are some pacifists in the church, the same way I'm glad there are some celibates in the church. Now, what did he mean? Well, both celibates, those who don't marry, and pacifists, those who will not fight, are living even now as we will all live in the kingdom of God. Remember, Jesus says, well, in the kingdom of God, no one is married or given in marriage, because we're living at a higher pitch of intensity. So celibates here below, like pacifists here below, are witnessing to that place of utter love and utter peace that we aspire to. But mind you, Cardinal George said, I don't want everyone to be a celibate here below, nor do I want everyone to be a pacifist. And I think that's a very good way to honor all the various values involved. So as I finished my talk last night at the Naval Academy, I'm in this magnificent chapel, and the windows are filled with these inspiring scenes. And one of them is two stained glass windows that kind of speak to each other. One is Michael, the warrior angel, but on the other side is an angel holding the dove of peace. And the point is that all just war finally serves the purposes of peace. And I would say finally serves the purpose of love, the defense of the innocent. When I was 14, I wanted to be a shortstop for the Cubs. I mean, I was interested in baseball above all sports. I was good in school, but I mean, school didn't captivate me or books. I think the discovery of Aquinas of Summa was like the acorn stirring. And I sensed, even as a little kid, that I'd follow that trajectory, which indeed I have, to this moment, talking to you. That I became a priest and a theologian and a teacher and a writer and an evangelist. It all came from that. So that's why that's such a special book to me.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the content director here at Word on Fire. Today we're having a bookish discussion. We're going to talk about Bishop Barron's favorite books. You're going to learn his favorite book of theology, poetry, fiction, his favorite stage play, and more. So stay tuned. But first, Bishop Barron, welcome to the show.
Hey, Brandon. How you doing?
Doing pretty well. Let's catch people up with some of the things you've been doing lately. In the midst of the COVID thing, most of your events and travels have been canceled, and you've been doing a lot of them through Zoom and Skype and things like that. And one exciting thing you just did was to interact with a bunch of Catholic students at Princeton University. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it was fun. I was invited to go out there and be with them in person, but of course that couldn't happen. So I just came here to the studio, and then we're on live on a Skype thing or Zoom or something with our own Leo Labrusco, who's active there, and then a lot of Catholic, I don't know if all of them were Catholic or not, but a lot of students from Princeton came on with really good questions, and we had a chance to see each other and talk, so I enjoyed that very much.
Yeah, give us a summary. What are some things on the minds of students at Princeton when it comes to God and religion?
Yeah, the ones that you find, I think, across the board. Is there a God? How do you show it? The problem of suffering. Some of them talked about more personal issues and evangelization and, how do you spread the faith? And in a culture that's so antipathetic toward religion, how do you live it and spread it? That sort of thing. In fact, I think that's what the main focus was, now that I remember, was more evangelization. But a lot of the standard questions that have beguiled human beings, from time immemorial.
Well, we're filming this episode a few weeks before it's going to release, but I wanted to talk about a couple of upcoming events you have as well. So one of them is you're addressing students at the Catholic University of America,
right.
And then you also have a big, exciting upcoming lecture. Maybe tell us about both of those.
Yeah, again, I was invited to my old alma mater, Theological College, which is on the campus of Catholic U. They have an alumni award every year, so they invited me to come and say Mass and receive the awards. I was really excited about that. Again, unfortunately, with COVID and all that, we had to turn into a virtual event. So what I'm going to do is respond to questions from the TC, we call it, Theological College community. They sent me in advance about 20. They're really good questions. So I'll be responding to those. And I think they give me the award virtually, so maybe they'll hold it up and I can smile through the camera.
They'll fax it to you.
They'll fax it to me. And then I think the next day I'm giving the Kenrick lecture. Again, I was supposed to be in St. Louis on the campus of Kenrick Seminary to give this annual lecture. I'll do it now from here. But I think prior to the lecture, we're having another session with the Kenrick students. Again, kind of an open Q&A type thing. So I enjoy that. Normally, I also enjoy being at these places. But, as you know, Brandon, travel is just so, we can do it, but travel is much more difficult now. So anyway, we're making progress.
All right, well, let's turn to the books. You and I love talking about books. I think almost every episode we're mentioning a book or a recommended title or something like that. A long time ago, I think way back when you were a professor at Mundelein, you compiled a list of your favorite books, your recommended books. We actually turned that into a PDF that listeners can download for free. You can find that at wordonfireshow.com/books, books with an S at the end. So wordonfireshow.com/books. Download the full list, and they're mostly theological books arranged by sub-discipline, subgenre, but you also identified your 5 favorite books overall, period, your 5 favorite books. I'd be curious to know as we work through some of these if they remain your favorites or if any have supplanted them, but I thought we'd talk through each one of them. So I'll briefly tick them off, then we'll spend time on each.
Okay.
So you have the Summa Theologia of Thomas Aquinas, you have the Divine Comedy of Dante, you have the 7-Story Mountain by Thomas Merton, you have Moby Dick by Herman Melville, and then you have Macbeth by William Shakespeare. So let's start with the Summa. I think listeners are obviously familiar with your love for Thomas Aquinas and especially his Summa, but talk to us about the personal significance of this book. When did you first come across it? How has it shaped you?
I can tell you exactly. You know, when I was at Fenwick High School and was introduced to one of Thomas's arguments for God's existence, I was so excited by that. I was all of 14 years old, and I can still see my yellow 10-speed bike. I rode from my house to the Thomas Ford Memorial Library in Western Springs, Illinois. And I was fumbling around, and I found Mortimer Adler's set of the great books. And I went through it, and he had 2 volumes on Thomas Aquinas. And volume 1 I took off the shelf, and I found, oh, there's the famous arguments. And so I checked it out. It was a big book. It was this high, this wide. You know, if I don't, I think we have it on the shelf here. I think Joe Glore found a copy of this. Anyways, big book, and I tucked it under my T-shirt, and I tucked the T-shirt in, and I was able to ride, home with the book. And it became, how would I put this, almost like a talisman for me. I didn't really understand it. I was 14 years old. I had no training whatsoever in philosophy or anything. I didn't know what 2/3 of the words meant. But I don't know, Brandon, what it was. There was something magical for me about that book. And it was this, obviously brilliant mind using very precise language, the language more of that I associated with the sciences, I suppose, speaking about these deep things about God. And it just fascinated me. Well, I had to return the book after, a couple weeks, whatever it was. And I found myself then going back. And I'd find it again and tuck it under my shirt, and I'd ride home with it. And I just was kind of making my way, trying to read these odd texts and think about them. I think I got Copleston's little paperback book on Aquinas around that time, and that helped me get an orientation to it, But it's a book that is, to call it interesting to me would be such an understatement. It was like something magical. And then, I think what it was, if I use that language of the acorn theory, when the person you're meant to be is sort of stirred in you when you're very young, and it just you just sing. It just strikes something. That's what it was like for me. When I was 14, I wanted to be a shortstop for the Cubs. I was interested in baseball above all sports. I was good in school, but school didn't captivate me or books. But that, I think the discovery of Aquinas' Summa was like the acorn stirring. And I sensed, even as a little kid, that I'd follow that trajectory, which indeed I have, to this moment, talking to you, that I became a priest and a theologian and a teacher and a writer and an evangelist. It all came from that. So that's why that's such a special book to me. And then obviously I've read it technically over many, many years and have done most of my academic work around it. And it's still a pied de touche, as the French say. It's this touchstone for me. So yeah, I feel strongly about the Summa Theologiae.
Your story of the young teenage Robert Barron stumbling into the library and coming across that book and having it be a life-changing moment reminds me of the tale of the young J.R.R. Tolkien, and I'm probably getting a few of these details wrong, but apparently there's an episode, I think when he was an undergraduate, and he stumbled into a library and he came across this book of Icelandic linguistics, something so obscure and niche, but he said it was the most exhilarating experience coming across this book. It sent tingles through his body. The way he described it, it was the acorn theory on display. It was this is what that man was made for, and he followed that through Middle Earth. I
buy that. I think there's a lot to it. And I'd say through God's grace and God's providence, those things happen, where God just says, okay, this is the road I want you to be on. And again, I think of that room full of kids, at Fenwick High School that all heard the same thing I heard, and it meant, probably next to nothing to them. Why did it mean that much to me? It's a mystery of providence, Why would that book of all books, have such an impact on me? It's providence.
You selected Thomas Aquinas for one of your pivotal players in your film series, and the criteria for selection for that series was people that not only impacted the church, but shaped the wider world, the wider culture. Talk about the significance and the impact of the Summa, not just on theologians, but how did it shape the last 700 years of history?
Well, I think anytime someone says faith and reason belong together, you see the heritage of Thomas Aquinas. No one in the great tradition sums that up. Now, other people would subscribe to it, of course, but I don't think anyone exemplifies it or sums it up better than Aquinas. So in that measure, he has a massive impact. Whenever a religious person thinks it's okay to think it through rationally, logically, philosophically, scientifically, so to that degree, I think he has this ongoing impact. In the life of the church, Thomas has ebbed and flowed over the centuries, at times having a huge impact, other times much less so. Some of his theses are condemned within a few years of his death, by bishops both in Paris and in England. During the centuries right after his death, it was the second part of the Summa that was most important. We associate probably the first part of the Summa with Aquinas, the arguments for God and God's attributes and creation. But it was the second part on the moral life because it so beguiled confessors and those doing the practical work of dealing with sinners. By the Council of Trent, they say on the desk of most of the Council Fathers, you had the Bible and you had the Summa of Aquinas. And then, of course, Ignatius and the Jesuits, because Ignatius has a huge interest in Aquinas. And then through the Jesuit institutions, Thomas's voice again resonates. More recently, late 19th century, with Leo XIII calling for a revival of Thomas studies. So he's ebbed and flowed up and down. Vatican II, Thomas is more conspicuous by his absence, I would say, in the text of Vatican II. I can testify the years after Vatican II, Thomas disappeared. I got him as a weird grace during those years. That was 1974 when I came across him. But he had mostly disappeared. But then, 1990s into the zeros, there's a Thomas revival going on. So anyway, I find that interesting how he reasserts himself, I think, because of the sheer quality and beauty of his thought. It never really goes away.
Let's close with this. How do you recommend people get into the Summa? I find a lot of people become attracted to Thomas when they hear people like you talk about him, and maybe they rush out and get that same volume from Mortimer Adler's Great Books of the Western World, and they crack it open, and it's immediately indecipherable. It's like someone wanting to get in the Bible, and they crack it open in Genesis and start trying to get into it. What do you recommend to first-timers who want to start reading the Summa? Yeah,
a couple things. Peter Kreeft's Summa of the Summa, I think, is a helpful way to get oriented. That Copleston book that helped me as a kid, simply called Aquinas by F.C. Copleston, is a good overview introduction. For the more lyrically minded, the great Chestertons, the Dumb Ox, his wonderful exploration of the life and writing of Aquinas. In a much more minor key, my own Thomas Aquinas Spiritual Master might be a way to get into it. Or think of Jean-Pierre Thorel's, also called Thomas Aquinas Spiritual Master, isn't it? The 2-volume overview. I think of James Weisheipel's great biography of Aquinas as a way to get into his life. Those are all ways. So there are good commentaries and good introductions to Thomas. Start with that, maybe, and then dive in.
I'll add a couple more of my favorites. Brian Davies has a number of good books on Aquinas, and then Edward Fazer, our good friend out there in California, he has a good introduction. I think it's just called Aquinas, A Beginner's Guide, which walks you through some of his major ideas.
Good.
Okay, let's turn to your second favorite book, and I'm not sure if these are necessarily in any order. These are just the top 5 favorites, but the second one is The Divine Comedy by Dante. When did you first come across The Divine Comedy?
I know exactly. It was the summer of 1990, and I was a language student in Germany. So I had started my doctoral studies in Paris, but that summer I went to the Goethe Institute in Freiburg and Breisgau in southwest Germany. And I was living in this miserable dorm room. The kid who had lived there during the year had cleared out, but not totally. He'd left all this stuff behind, weird decorations, and it was like a weird college kid's room. That's where I was assigned to live. So I did my Goethe Institute all day, like 5-6 hours of nothing but German. And, reading, writing, listening, speaking German. I'd come home to that room. And so I brought with me, I forget why, I brought with me the little paperback volume of the Inferno of Dante. And I'd never read it. I'd never really read a word of Dante. I knew of him, of course, and how important he was. Never read him. So I remember, I can still kind of see myself lying on my stomach on this bed with the little paperback. And I began reading the Inferno as a little break from my hyper-intense German study. And it just, I don't know what it was about that particular translation or that time in my life or what, but it just began to sing to me like a novel. I read it with great interest, and the footnotes were good, and I would read the footnotes with great interest, and it got me into Dante. That's how I first came across him, and then that's just started this, since then, my lifelong process of reading him and reading about him.
Why do you think Dante has remained so enduring and beloved? I mean, it seems like he's right up there with Homer, Virgil, the author of Beowulf, and Dante. It's like, why him? Why this poem?
Because I think of Lord Kenneth Clark, during Civilization at one point, he says, "Is there sensuality in Dante? Of course there is. There's everything in Dante." I've always been struck by, that's right. There's everything in Dante. He's like one of those people that, all of life is in Dante. And then all of it under the aegis of the Catholic faith that, according to T.S. Eliot, the two great figures in all the Western literature, Dante and Shakespeare, and there's no third, says Eliot, that one of the two greatest writers in the West writes all about the Catholic faith, And so as a Catholic and as a lover of literature, it's this feast. And it's life. All of life is there, both natural and supernatural, told in the most compelling poetry. So that's a heady mix.
So you got this epic poem. It's spread across 3 different books, the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso. Do you have a favorite among those 3?
Yeah, probably like most people, the Inferno is probably the most fun to read, because his imagination can kind of go crazy. But in a way, as I taught Dante over the years and wrote about him, I became very attracted to the Purgatorio, the central one, because I think it's about the way a lot of us have to live the spiritual life, that we become aware of our sins, and then we enter into this process of purification. I find that it really sings to me as a spiritual person. Yes, I'm anticipating, with the grace of God, Paradiso, but even now, I can live the dynamics of the Purgatorio, and to me that makes it very interesting.
Let's turn to the next book. This one is The Seven-Story Mountain by Thomas Merton. We've spoken about this book a lot on this podcast. I remember the very first episode we did, which was covering Pope Francis's speech to Congress when he first visited America, and Pope Francis favorably mentioned Thomas Merton, and so that got us talking. But then we've talked about this title often. In fact, one of the reasons why we've created our own edition of it, a Word on Fire Classics edition, is because of how much this book has meant to you. So, by the way, if listeners are looking to get a beautiful version of this text, you can find it at wordonfireshow.com/Merton. But tell us the story once again, or maybe for the first time, for those who haven't heard it, of how this book literally crashed into your life.
Yeah, I was working at Crocs and Brentano's bookstore in Oak Brook, Illinois. I was 16. My brother worked there too, and I was in the stock room in the back, and I was preparing, a lot of things. And there was a custom at the time, I forget why, but if a paperback got a little bit worn out, they could tear the cover off, and they'd sent the cover downtown, and then the book was just available. You could throw it out or give it to somebody. So anyway, my brother is back there with me, and I'm doing something. I'm filling out cards or something. And he throws this paperback to me, a coverless paperback, and it lands in my lap like this. I catch it. And he goes, "Oh, you might like this. It's written by a Trappist monk." And I said, why would I want to read a book by some Buddhist? And my brother said, Trappists are Catholics, you idiot. And that's how the 7-Story Mountain landed literally in my lap. And so I took it home, and mind you, I'm 16, so I'd had the Thomas Aquinas experience at 14. I'd begun my kind of clandestine reading of these arcane religious texts. I'm kind of getting interested in the whole religious thing. Well, then I pick up this book, which is brilliantly written by this man who had trained to be a writer, who was a man of the world in every sense of that term, and who then went through this extraordinary process of conversion to religion, to Catholicism, and then eventually becomes a Trappist monk, like the most intense kind of monk you can become. Well, it's a captivatingly romantic story. And I use that word on purpose because I think it's a story about someone falling in love with God and told in such a compelling way. So you're 16. You're right at this kind of romantic period of life, you know what I mean? And I was getting interested in religion, and here's this book about falling in love with God in this radical way. Well, it just sang to my heart. Where Aquinas, the first Thomas, was really singing to my head and clarifying a lot of things. Merton, who's no slouch intellectually, mind you, but began singing to other aspects of my being, you know, and to see this life given totally to God. Here's something funny, Brandon. When I was reading that book, so I'm 16, 1976 approximately, I had just discovered the Beatles. So the Beatles break up in 1970, but I kind of discover them as I'm discovering music and everything else. And to this day, if one of the classic Beatles songs comes on, it triggers Merton in my mind, because I remember reading The 7-Story Mountain while I'm listening to, you know, Hey Jude or to Let It Be or to, you know, the great Beatles songs. So my point there is that it just began to work its way into my consciousness, you know, very deeply.
You know, if you go to most Catholic bookstores today, you'll see a whole section dedicated to conversion stories. It's like a whole industry. We have so many good stories, you know, all the way back from Augustine's Confessions to Newman's Apologia. You have, you know, more contemporary ones
Dorothy
like Scott
Day.
Hahn's Rome Sweet Home, The Long Loneliness of Dorothy Day. What sets Thomas Merton's story apart from all these other memoirs of conversion?
Well, it's not unlike Augustine's, because I mean Augustine is a sublime writer and an extremely brilliant theologian. Something similar with Merton. It was Fulton Sheen who compared the 7-Story Mountain to the Confessions of Augustine, and there's a lot to that. Merton brings his religious sensibility, but also the great sensibility of a writer, because he was training really to be a novelist, to be a poet. In fact, he's quite a fine poet, published quite widely after he became a Trappist. But I think it's that combination. It's told with such psychological perception and such a novelist gift for the description of the time and place. It's full of humanity. Merton is you know, like all of us, kind of a conflicted figure and, you know, full of light and darkness, and he's kind of honest about all of that. I think that makes it very compelling. It's a writer's tale. You know who else really admired the 7-Story Mountain was Evelyn Waugh. So Waugh writes one of the early kind of reviews of it for a British public, and in fact, I think he writes the preface to the British edition of it.
I think he helped edit it too as well. He helped shape it.
And gave it the title, it's not called 7-Story Mountain, but rather Elected Silence, which is a line from a Jared Manley Hopkins poem. So Waugh caught all of that. In fact, when did that come out, Brandon? A couple years ago, this wonderful little book of the letters between Waugh and Merton. Because starting back then, we're this sort of elder statesman. By that time, Waugh would have been in his, 40s or 50s. And he's giving Merton, who's a pretty young man when he wrote The 7-Story Mountain, kind of writerly advice about how, you know, he should do this and that and change this. But he had a great admiration for The 7-Story Mountain. So I think it's the writerly quality, the perception, the psychological perceptiveness, as well as the rich spirituality.
So again, if you haven't read 7-Story Mountain, you might consider getting the Word on Fire Classics edition. It's a beautiful version of it. It's got an introduction by Bishop Barron himself. So find it at wordonfireshow.com/Merton. All right, next up is Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Now, this might be a little surprising from some people, I think. Why this book? How did it impact you? How are you different for having read it?
Oh my gosh! I think, as I remember now with this, we propose like genre. So the Summa is my favorite book of theology. Merton is probably like spirituality. Dante, poetry. I think Moby Dick I chose for fiction. I love that book. I've read it in its entirety, I think 3 times, and studied it and read about it quite a bit. When did I first read it? I don't remember. I don't have that same kind of vivid memory when I first read it. I think, in fact, I tried the first time and only got a certain distance. And when Melville goes into 50 pages of describing the whaling techniques, But at the right point in my life, I got through it and loved it. That line, I think it's Dr. Johnson's line about if you're bored with London, you're bored with life. And there's like Dante too. Moby Dick, if you're bored with that book, you're bored with life. Because here's this genius. I think Melville I think he's the greatest of the American fiction writers. At this key point in his life, he retired to a little log cabin. And for an intense year, produced this novel, the greatest American novel. And it broke him. He never recovered from it psychologically. He writes Billy Budd and some of these wonderful shorter pieces, but he never recovered from it. It's like Bertrand Russell with North Whitehead when they wrote the Principia Mathematica. He was a very young man, and Russell said, but it broke my mind. I could never operate at that level again. And Russell wrote extensively till he was in his 90s, but he said he never reached that level. And that's true, he never did. Melville's similar. It's like he poured his entire self into this book, and it's filled with life. Friendship and hatred and rivalry and obsession and jealousy and religion and sex and fate and nature. It's like, all of it is there in this great book. One way in, I often compare when I would teach Dante, compare the beginning of the Divine Comedy with the beginning of Moby Dick, because they're both dealing with relatively young men who are in a kind of suicidal depression and have to go through this wrenching journey to find the way out. In Dante's case, the journey through hell, purgatory, and heaven. In Melville's case, this sea journey, with Captain Ahab and all the people on that little ship, the Pequod. But they're both journey stories about a young man trying to make his way from one rather, like when Melville says, when it's a dreary November in your soul. That's how Moby Dick begins. Now it's time to go to sea, So they're adventure stories that are about external adventures, but really about the inner adventure. What do I love about it? I mean, look at Captain Ahab. Melville was reading a lot of Shakespeare at the time. We know that. And boy, you can hear it in someone like Captain Ahab, this famously tragic figure. But listen to his speeches. When Ahab speaks, it's like Macbeth. It's like Hamlet. It's like Henry V. I mean, it's full of Shakespearean angst and so on. What's he after? He's after the white whale, the most famous symbol in all of American literature, no question about it. What's the white whale? Well, it's nature, it's fate, it's whatever. But as I read Moby Dick, I can't help but think the white whale is evocative of God. Are we obsessed with God? Yes, and searching to find God. But is there the danger? Ahab enters into this struggle, this battle with God, a bit like Jacob and the angel, right? And just as the angel wounds Jacob, so the whale wounds Ahab, rips his leg off, But now Ahab comes with even greater fury. Mind you, Ahab named for the worst of Israel's kings, right? So whoever gave him that name. But now he's coming after, with fury after God. But God cannot be conquered that way. And by the end of the story, of course, Moby Dick rises up from the depths and destroys the ship and kills Ahab. And I think it's, now again, from a typically American Protestant perspective. So you're not dealing with Dante. That's a very Catholic imagination. With Melville, you're into a Protestant space. But this furious struggle with God, I think, is at the heart of that story. So anyway, I could go on and on about Moby Dick, but it is the great American novel.
Well, I'm utterly shocked to hear that you've read the whole thing 3 times.
Oh,
I know
gosh,
for most people,
yeah.
like once is a lifetime accomplishment for
But then
that book.
you got to go back though, and then you really begin to see it. No, it's marvelous.
How about some advice for people that get bogged down in the numerous details about, whaling biology, whale oil harvesting, all that stuff?
Maybe skip it. If you're getting super bored, just skip it and get to the narrative again. That's okay. Part of it, Brandon, too, it's interesting. Remember Umberto Eco, when he commences The Name of the Rose, and you have these long, long sections about monastic life? He said, I had to put my reader through his own novitiate. In other words, that was meant to be boring. It was meant to be like, because he was drawing you into the world of this monastery. And it's only in that monastery that you're going to get the story. Tolkien, famously, with Bilbo's endless birthday party at the beginning of Lord of the Rings. And like, why am I going through this birthday party? He had to get you into his world, right? Well, same with Moby Dick. That's why you're, about how the oil comes out of the whale and the cutting its head off and how you, but you're meant to be drawn into this obsessive world of this whaling ship. But if that's not working for you the first time through, skip it and get to the sea adventure.
You're getting awfully close to triggering my Tolkien sensibilities by implying that there's a boring line in Tolkien, but we'll let that pass for now.
Don't say Bilbo's 11st birthday party. People are like, why is he going on and on about this birthday party? Can't we get to the, rollicking adventure of this story? Which, of course, he does. But he had to put you through a novitiate, I think, at the beginning.
All right, let's look to the 5th and final book, and this was written by the great William Shakespeare, who you mentioned had formed the mind of Herman Melville, and it's his great play, Macbeth. So first of all, why do you set this play above all the other Shakespearean dramas?
Oh, I don't know. And, again, some of that is kind of arbitrary. How could you not see Hamlet as one of the, monuments of the human spirit? Maybe it's because I first came across Shakespeare in high school. I think when I was a freshman, we read Romeo and Juliet. That was probably the first thing I ever read. And, I've told people it's like my discovery of Aquinas at the same age when I was 14. I didn't understand Romeo and Juliet. I understood, the basic lines of it. But my reaction at that time was that there should be such a thing. You know what I mean? That such a thing should exist, I thought was marvelous. Like, what is this? These words and the complexity of it. Well, I think a little bit later in high school, maybe junior year, we read Macbeth. And we might have even, as I remember, kind of quasi-acted it out. I think we kind of, And so it was one of my earliest exposures to Shakespeare was through Macbeth. And I don't know. My good friend Ed Oakes, who died way too young, the great father Ed Oakes, the Balthazar scholar, he and I used to go to the Shakespeare Theater in Chicago on Navy Pier, which is beautiful. Specially constructed theater for Shakespeare. And he and I would go down, we'd have dinner together, and then we'd go to the play. And I remember one night we were going to go see, it was a Hamlet production. And he said, I just want to close my eyes and let the language wash over me. And that's kind of, with Shakespeare, it's the language. I've just been watching, all during the COVID thing, the great Patrick Stewart reading all the Shakespeare sonnets every day. And, the Shakespeare sonnets are so complex that you're not like, oh yeah, I got it. It's all figured out. It's not so much that. The first time you hear it, it's let the language and its rhythms and its color. So Macbeth had that impact on me. But then, like Moby Dick, like the Divine Comedy, all of life is there. The psychological perception, the wrestling with, Thomas talks about wealth, pleasure, power, and honor. Well, they're all there, aren't they? With Macbeth, it's largely power and honor, probably. But how a human being deals with the greatest temptations, and no one articulates those dynamics better than Shakespeare. Thomas can name them in his sort of abstract scholastic vocabulary. Shakespeare lets you feel it, and you enter with the greatest depth of perception into the texture of that experience. So anyone that's ever felt the tug of ambition or the tug of power, what I wouldn't do to get what I want, even though I know it's the wrong thing, but enter into that play and it'll remind you of what's going on in your own psychology, you know? That's what Shakespeare, I think, does better than almost anybody. Anyway, I could go on and on about Shakespeare.
It's often been recommended that people, instead of reading Shakespeare, watch it
Yeah.
performed. That's the way it's intended. Do you
Absolutely.
have a favorite performance
Yeah.
of Macbeth you like?
Yeah, I do, and I'm glad you asked about that because it's the famous one from the 70s, a very young Ian McKellen, long before he's Gandalf the Grey, and the great Dame Judi Dench. But when they're quite young, they're probably in their early 30s maybe, and it was a production by Trevor Nunn, who was a famous director of Shakespeare at the time, also a young man. And they did it in this dark, just a dark space with the simplest sort of setting, nothing to distract your attention. They wore the simplest, most understated clothes. You know who's in that production too? The man who eventually played the Emperor in Star Wars. It plays the porter in that famous scene where they're knock, 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 and the porter opens the door. Well, anyway, that production, you get it on YouTube, they said they wanted nothing to distract from the language. And you get these two sublime actors, McKellen and Judi Dench, doing Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. And just watching their interaction in those famous speeches is stunning. So yeah, that's my favorite production of Macbeth.
Well, we'll be sure to link to all of these book recommendations in the show notes. And again, if you want the full list of all of Bishop Barron's favorite books, there's dozens more that we have on the PDF. You can find it at wordonfireshow.com/books. Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. Today we have one from Alexandria. She's a new convert to the Catholic faith from Vancouver, Canada. And she has a really interesting question about something she found in Aquinas' writing that she wants clarification about. Here's her question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Alexandria, and I'm a new Catholic from Vancouver, Canada. Aquinas was really instrumental in my conversion, but I was disappointed that in his articles on the production of woman, he speaks repeatedly of women's defectiveness and inferiority. I recognize the language of Aristotelian reproductive biology here, and I know how much Aristotle would have influenced Aquinas. So my question is, did Aquinas really believe women were inferior or defective? And if so, would modern Catholic theologians disagree now that Aristotelian biology has been mostly disproven? Thank you.
Yes and yes. So you're absolutely right. I mean, the instincts behind your question are right. Namely, that Thomas was very influenced by Aristotle, both in Aristotle's science, his physics, and his metaphysics. Are we obliged, to subscribe now to the physics and sort of medical theorizing of Aristotle? Absolutely not. Was Aristotle, and therefore Thomas, wrong about their conception of women? Yeah, absolutely. And we're not the least bit beholden to those views. Are there metaphysical insights in Aristotle that remain of perennial value? Yeah, and that's what I think what remains most important. But the science and medical sort of physics of Aristotle, no, we're not obliged to hold to that. And no Catholic is obliged to hold those views of Aquinas in that manner. And it speaks to a wider point, too. As I reverence Thomas Aquinas, as you well know, it doesn't mean that Thomas Aquinas is somehow infallible or that every little thing Thomas said about any subject is ipso facto correct. Well, of course not. That's true of nobody in the great tradition. Augustine, right about everything? Come on. There's nobody in the great tradition who's right about everything. So no, don't feel the least bit obligated to hold to those, clearly, by our lights now, silly and erroneous views of Aquinas on women.
Well, thanks so much for listening and watching to this episode of the show. Before we go, I wanted to shout out some of our special patrons who support this show and make it happen. Lucy Kaysen from Prairieville, Louisiana, Rosemary Parker from Oswego, New York, Ethereal Matter, I'm guessing that's a pseudonym, from Cincinnati, Ohio, and Maria Sostak from Spring Lake, Michigan. Thank you guys. Thanks so much for making this show happen, for supporting us. If you like this show, maybe, we're on episode, 259. Maybe you've been listening for a long time and you like it, you want to get it out to more people.